but we are recording.
Okay. Let me, should I share my screen? Let me do, where is it? It's this. Are you watching this?
Yes, I can
Are you
see it.
seeing my
Yes.
screen? Okay. So yeah, last week I had like 14 pages of material. This week I have 28 pages. So yeah, a lot of material. So last week I basically we rehearsed some of what we were discussing during Reza's presentations. This was one of Gabriel's marvelous diagram that I took a picture of with our faces, with our interested looks.
Yeah, you're astounded.
Yeah, like what's that?
What the
So
fuck?
what the fuck is going on? So yeah, I used, as you might have noticed, I used these categories that are right there. That are the categories that are the basic structure of the first section of book two, in order to organize the arguments of section three, right? So there is an argument for local consistency, for relative difference, and for operational closure before, in a sense, are presented the three operations of minimum, conjunction, and envelope, right? So we were talking about this. I'm not going to read all this again, but you know the inconsistency of the whole. You might remember the chimera argument, right? Like the set of non-reflexive multiples, right? And there's this quote about it. Now, if the chimera is reflexive, this means that it presents itself. It is within its own multiple composition. But what is the chimera? The multiple of all non-reflexive multiples. If the chimera is among these multiples, it is because it is not reflexive. But we have just supposed that it is inconsistency. Therefore, the chimera is not reflexive. However, if it is by definition the multiple of all non-reflexive multiples, if it is not reflexive, it is in this all, sorry, it is in this all, this whole, and therefore presents itself. It is reflexive. Inconsistency once again. So it's just a kind of a rehearsal of Russell's paradox. If it is if it counts itself, it doesn't count itself, which is a inconsistent proposition. So there you go. That there you get the formal version of this that we rehearsed last time. Then local consistency. We just remember, right? Inconsistency of the whole, the first category. Then local consistency, relative difference, and operational closure. Because of this or they say inconsistency of the whole, right? Every consistency will be a local consistency, not a consistency guaranteed, top down guaranteed by the universe, the universal set, right? So as I said there, if consistency is not guaranteed by a top down approach, since the whole is not, it must be constructed from below. This amounts to a local consistency. So because multiples must have a local consistency, and then there is this also this short meditation on the axiom of separation, which is Pariu's way of defending formally this local consistency and to avoiding the emergence of Russell's paradox by avoiding basically, Frege's idea that any well-formed predicate must have a class or a set that instantiate the predicate. So this is why Russell comes up with a predicate that gives rise to an inconsistency. So because you can't really commit yourself to such a universal scope of predicates that ought to be or can be instantiated. So you have the axiom of separation that presupposes a set that is already given with a predicate that sort out within the set that already is the subsets that satisfy the predicate. So I think the quote is interesting. The axiom of separation draws a conceptual consequence from Russell's paradox. This paradox shows that one cannot pass directly from a predicate to the multiple of the beings that fall under this predicate. Keeping this in mind, we introduce an ontological condition. Given a set and the predicate, there exists the subset of this set comprising the elements that fall under the predicate. You no longer say, this is very important. I think
it sounds so Wittgenstein to say, you no longer say.
Yeah, you know.
Rather
yeah,
you say.
Even reading about you, I have my tastes that are, you know, formed under a certain influence. So you don't get to say, as Wittgenstein would say.
Exactly. Yeah.
You don't get to say, given P, there exists M, set M, such that, you know, there is, it instantiates that you get a formula, every element of M has the property. That will make the entirety of language inconsistent, Russell's paradox. You say instead, given any E and P, there always exists an E that is included in such that every element of E has the predicate, right? Am I translating right? This is say inclusion in the French version. It says part for this symbol. Part of E is a part of, which is inclusion. Anyway, just because he has some interesting choices or terminological choices, like he doesn't say logical disjunction, he says alternative, but it's okay. It is logical disjunction, the same. You can separate in E all the alpha elements which fall under the predicate P. There is, like a proposition, there is, which is given with P, the set E. The paradox then ceases to function. Yeah, because you separate a set that is already there, that is not, which consistency is guaranteed by definition, and then you get to separate the subsets, the predicates that comprise the set, the subsets defined by the predicates that are there, right? So local consistency and relative difference. I think this is very interesting. We also rehearsed this last time, but just cats are.
I think this is very interesting. This is what the way that you summarize this, because even given the axiom of separation, I think it is easy to understand, or at least for me, the expression that every being is being there. Like axiom, this is really the result of the axiom of separation, that every being, every multiple is a multiple that is already there according to the axiom of separation. We cannot talk about beings that actually come to being as a result of the declaration of their being. They have to be there.
Yeah, this is, I think I have two comments on that, Reza. One of them is that this was something that interested me a lot in your presentations, because I think it also touched upon the fact that I don't think Badiou starts from, you know, local worlds or anything like that. It stems from the inconsistency of the whole. The fact that the consistency is local is, I mean, I'm not sure. I think there is a reading that one can have of the book that maybe does not stress this enough, that this is attached, the locality is attached to the fact of the inconsistency of the whole. It is not just an ontological result, it is also a phenomenological result. It is an ontological result that has a consequence for the phenomenological result, right? This was one thing that I think we started discussing when you were already presenting. And what was the second thing? I get lost in my own thoughts too easily. What are you saying, Reza? Can you repeat?
Oh, I was just saying how important, and I'm really happy that you're singling that out, how important the axiom of separation is. I don't think that he discusses the way that you presented it here, but it's absolutely, absolutely proper, the way that I understand it. That axiom of separation is already in the realm of ontology. Axiom of separation in another language is basically capturing what Badiou says in Logics of Word, that every being is being there.
Yeah. I had a second thing to say, but now I lost the second thing.
Okay.
But yes, yeah. Actually, yeah, I think I'm on the same page. I think the text lends itself to an interpretation that valorizes this as something important, but it also lends itself to an interpretation that, you know, I don't know why this is there, in a sense. So local consistency is directly a result of the inconsistency of the whole, and the axiom of separation is the way in which you get to constrain the emergence of, oh yeah, this was a second, you get to constrain the emergence of sets. And the second thing I just remembered, it's good that I can get to, you know, horse around like this, because I end up remembering what I was thinking. Yeah, the second thing was, which is important for Badiou's program, which is to limit the powers of linguistic conceptualization, in a sense. Not that, maybe to say limit the powers of linguistic conceptualization is a bad choice of words, but it's not really to limit anything, but I think from Badiou's point of view is to locate the powers of the formalism as elsewhere, in a sense. It's not language that gets to pronounce what there is, because if language gets to pronounce what there is, you have to accept inconsistencies. So it seems to me that the axiomatic method is there because, in a sense, it limits, it ends up limiting the centrality of language, in a sense. I'm not saying I'm for this. I'm saying I think this is Badiou's, it seems to be Badiou's position about, you know, the linguistic turn and everything. He's often very hostile to this way of putting things, even though from my point of view, you can always say that this high-think algebra he's developing here is also a way of describing. But anyway, you can reintegrate into, you know, linguistic choice. But anyway,
I think the way that
I don't think, yeah, I think there is more to. But sorry, Reza, say first of all.
No, nothing. I was just saying that the way I would rephrase what JP said, which I agree with, is if Badiou wanted to say this in a, or if you want to say this in a different way, is Badiou says ZFC or ZFC, the way you guys call it, is limiting the power of language or the prodigality of language over being, and Badiou espouses that that approach that ZFC has. He's not the one who says that. He's just espousing what ZFC says.
Yeah, I agree, but I think that I don't think he's and I think this is a big kind of bump in the road, because it's true he has a bombastic statement in that same chapter where he says language can only divide, language divides being, language cannot summon something. But I think that the core of the argument that connects axiom separation to his theory of language is not restrictive, is actually constructive, because ZFC allows you to derive the theory of the idea of parts from the idea of sets, right? So if you accept this basic distinction between, let's say, a set and its power set as the set of all possible subsets it can construct, you have a sort of, let's say, okay, sorry, let me do this. I want to.
He wants to show off.
Let me show my gadget.
Yeah.
Like if you have this, like a set, and you have here a power set, right? It will contain subsets based on the elements that are here, right? And you can say that, well, all the functions leading from this set to this power set, to the subsets here, these functions here, they are possible predicates, right?
Yeah.
Okay, but the fact is that the relation between, let me call this then P, a predicate. The relation between P and the power set, or sorry, the relation between the elements in P and the power set. So we say these things are included. They're part of this property. They share this property, right? The relation of inclusion can be derived from the relation of belonging. So if I have something like, if I want to say, just clear this up. If I want to say, what's the formula again? If you want to say, let's say that Z, sorry guys, I'm learning this, but I'm really happy about it. D is including X. This is the same thing as saying that for every, I don't know, Q belongs to Z, therefore Q belongs to X, right? If something is part of Z, therefore it will be part, if something belongs to Z, therefore it will belong to X. So you can reduce the relation of, which is defining here predication, to the relation of belonging, which he's calling an ontological relation. So we have actually a genetic. Suddenly a lot of things on the chat. Yeah.
But isn't that a drawing pad? He's using a drawing pad then. I think he draws poorly. This is a problem.
What?
Yeah, he's going to give you a drawing pad.
Yeah, guys, I'm really sorry. I'm really happy about this, but I'm crappy at it. Like, it's not the technology, it's the user. But you see the problem, like the thing that is here defining the predication here is actually genetically derived from a primitive, which is the ontological relation. So it's not restrictive. It's yeah, it's actually not. It's not restrictive. It's a matter of increasing our power. This particular approach to ontology allows us to derive the operator we're using to define predication. So we're not restricting it. That it is restricted, and now predication depends on a set, and so functions of inclusion depend on functions of belonging, is not an argument of I will condition this. You need this to restrict it to be able to speak properly. It's simply that one thing is derived from the other. One operator depends on the other. So I think it's not a restrictive argument fundamentally. It's actually a one about the richness of the formalism. The formalism is rich enough for us to go back. One thing implies the other, right? Within this system.
Yeah.
But I think what JP is referring to, this is true, but what JP is referring to axiom of separation has a very restrict function, and that function is to basically says that you cannot define subsets, or you cannot define sets, or you cannot define any collection or multiples through a formula that is expressible in language. So in order for a formula to work, there has to be a ground for that formula, whereby that formula borrows its elements from. I think that's a very important thing within ZFC. All I was trying to say is, actually, Badiou is not the one who says that. It is ZFC who says that.
Yeah, and I think there's a historical argument to be had because you know this is very now I can start talking about all this other stuff, but this is the motivation also for type theory, you know, and you know Russell's solution to this as well, which is a kind of restrictive in this sense. You know, you have to have some kind of restriction in order for such paradox of self-reference, Liar's paradox, Russell's paradox, all the variants to not emerge. So you have this has a certain history wherein this kind of approach, which I take the axiom of separation to be an example, tries to, in a sense, restrict the you know restrict the instantiation of predication. It's not any predication that gets to be instantiated in a set. So this is the problem. But I think Badiou's choice of the axiom of separation is interesting and consistent with his materialism in a sense, because it seems to me that interpreted in a certain way, the axiom of separation seems to say, okay, there are these stuff out there, and you get to your predications must work on them in a sense. Mm. So you don't get a generative idealist framework wherein you just imagine a certain predicate and there's a set for that. Mm-hmm. In a sense. So it is consistent with his with what I take to be his brand of materialism.
Yeah. So actually, think about it. Ontology is already conditioned by this, because axiom of separation, which belongs to ontology, is already the result of the Russell paradox. So basically, you have the inconsistency of the whole, which is the set of all sets. Since the set of all sets don't exist, all you have is local consistency. Like axiom of separation is the local consistency. So logics of the world is just another rephrasing of what we already know from ontology.
Yeah, that part of logics of world, yes.
Yeah, that part of logic of world, yes.
Yeah, this is actually, I was saving this kind of question for later, but this is one thing that interests me. I mean, the passage from what he inherits from his ontology, and that gets to be reaffirmed in logics of worlds, and what is, you know, separate from that, in a sense. There is an easy differentiation that one can make, that, you know, what's internal to a world belongs to phenomenology, and the regimentation of these worlds belongs to ontology, in a sense, because, you know, because of the incompleteness, of the inconsistency of the whole, which is an idea, an ontological idea that he inherits from ontology, and the proof of this idea of its truth, or the truth value that he associates with it, he takes it to be true in a sense, right? The whole is not. It's a decision that is effective. It's actual in his thought. Is done through a reduction by absurdum. So I mean, there is a kind of it is obeying the logic of a classical world, right? And it seems to me, I'm not sure if intra-worldly, I mean, he says it's not so. Worlds can be non-classical. I will talk about this today. But there is something, I'm having a hard time to pin down the exact, you know, point wherein, you know, a classic world like the world of ontology, there is a situation that is capable of presenting the presentation of all situations. How does it relate to, you know, different logics that can, you know, exist within this framework, which is a classic world framework, right? So it has to do with the relationship between the inside and the outside of a certain logic, and the relationship between these different logics, right? Anyway, this was a question.
You lost me a little bit there.
I think we can get back to it when we have a bit more
Okay.
material.
Yeah.
Because
yeah,
the opposite
we'll
is also
get to the classic world.
yeah, because the opposite will also be true. From the perspective of logics of worlds, classical worlds are a case of a broader logic restricted.
Yeah.
Right? So you restrict
yeah,
certain values of a Heyting algebra, you get the classical Boolean world. So, and in the case of ontology, yeah, but yeah, we get there.
So, yeah, the first time he talks about world, but I think this is very important. Relative difference, formal treatment. Don't remember if we read this. Yeah, this is the identity. What is this? Fonction d'apparaître, function of appearing.
No, we didn't
right?
get there.
Yeah, okay. So I'll read it. It is clear that multiples in situation can differ more or less, resemble one another, be nearer or farther, and so on. It is thus necessary to admit that what governs appearing is not the ontological composition of a particular being, a multiple, but rather the relational evaluations, which are determined by the situation and which localize that being within it. Unlike the legislation of a pure multiple, these evaluations do not always identify local difference with global difference. They are not ontological. He's making a reference here to the fact that it is also a kind of anticipation of the logic of a classical world when he says that any local difference within ontology uh, uh, imply global difference. That means one difference of one element, one difference of membership imply that the set is different. Everything is different, right? So there's this very strict implication between local and global. So this is what he's referring to here, right? Unlike the legislation of a pure multiple, which is ontology, these evaluations do not always identify local difference with global difference, right? They are not ontological. That is why we will give the name logic to the laws of the relational network which determine the worldly appearing of multiple beings. Every world possesses its own logic, which is the legislation of appearing or of the there, of being there. But you suppose the fonction d'apparaître, a function of appearing, in addition to their composition as multiples, their being that is not their being there, that is written for a multiple alpha and a multiple beta, ID alpha beta, which indexes their degree of identity, right? So the function of appearing is the first transcendental indexing. It is a question of knowing what is the degree of identity between two beings of the same world. That is the degree according to which these two beings appear identical. But what are the values of the function of appearing? What measures the degree of identity between two appearances of multiplicities? Here too, there is no general or totalizing answer. The scale of evaluation of appearing and thus the logic of a world depends on the singularity of that world itself. What we can say is that in every world such a scale exists, and it is this scale that we call the transcendental.
So we also get
say that this.
Yeah, sorry.
Go on.
I was going to say that we last time we got to this point that we have a kind of mutual implication between there being a scale and there being a world, right? That's why the statement, we can say that in every world such a scale exists because having such an immanent scale is what makes it a world. So those two things are connected, right?
Yeah.
Actually, to some degree, it is through a different scale that you get a world. So it's like if you want to put a cart before the horse, the way that Badiou presents, he says, since there is a world, there is a scale. Whereas what I think we discussed last time was, since there are different scales, there are different worlds.
Not sure maybe they're equivalent in a sense.
Yeah, I think in this up to here they are a bit equivalent because
yeah, because what we had in mind is the fact that the world is not something that is there and then you get multiples in it, but the world consists through the multiples that are in it, in a sense that they are,
yeah, that's true.
I think that
partial ordering. Sorry.
Yeah, I think that the next quote will help with this, because once we get, I mean, the question of, he mentions this function that applies to the relation between alpha and beta and gives you a degree P. But that degree P is also in the world. So I think we'll now get the specific qualification of what a scale is, the set of these degrees. For now, it depending on what P is, let's say if P is something not in the world, a separate thing, a degree that comes from God knows where, then multiples A and B by themselves are not, multiples in a situation are not going to constitute a world, because you need this extra thing. If P is actually another multiple in the same world, and the relation between, and the function of appearing relates multiples to a multiple in the same world. So if the scale is immanent to the world, then relation between multiples, evaluation between multiples by a multiple, and the constitution of a world are then equivalent, because you don't have an added thing of a different quality. And I think that's where he's at.
Yeah. So the quote goes to say that IDA alpha beta equal P means that with regard to their appearing in that world, the beings alpha and beta, which remain perfectly and univocally determined in their multiple composition, are identical to the P degree, or are P identical. The essential requirement then is that the degrees P are held in an order structure, so that, for instance, it can make sense to say that in a fixed referential world, alpha is more identical to beta than to gamma. In formal terms, if ID alpha beta equals P and ID alpha gamma equals Q, this means that P is bigger than Q, right? So it's just a definition of an order structure that must be there, and actually it is constitutive of the world. It's not like something that is in the world besides other stuff. I think a world is a world to the extent that there is an order structure that is given by a transcendental. At least this is my reading. A world is a world. I would say I would phrase it like this: a world is a world to the extent that there is an order structure. Something like that, like this. Don't know if you guys disagree with this formulation. So this gives an operational closure.
A partial order structure.
Partial. Yeah, partial. An order structure, he says, and then he adds the proviso that he's a partial order structure because there are multiples that are unrelated to other multiples given a certain scale, a certain degree of intensity. Like in his example, if you remember correctly, there's the house, the summer, the autumn landscape, the fall landscape, right? Something like this. And then there's the motorcycle noise. Motorcycle noise is, he takes the motorcycle noise as incomparable in a sense to the landscape that presents itself. I'm not sure this is a very clear though example, right? Because it also depends on the transcendental in question. Because if your transcendental is intrinsically, if you take sound to be, a partial ordering in that world, okay, the motorcycle is louder than everything else, but it is related, right? So it's.
Aqui estão os principais resultados de YouTube.
Yeah, my cell phone started to
record
search for something that I just said. So no, I'm not searching for that. Sorry.
Okay.
So it seems to depend on what is the transcendental in question. I think this is an open question for him. He says a world is a world as long as it has an order structure, a partial order structure. But what is the specific transcendental degree of intensity? It seems to be something that can be
depends on the world, yeah.
Depends on the world, and depends on, in a sense, what what is measuring the world. Like when it says the motorcycle noise is unrelated or unbounded to other multiples in his example, I find this kind of dodgy because from certain frames of reference, it is bounded.
Yeah, but he says it's bounded. It's not. At first it's not, but then you need to give it kind of an envelope, a zoom out, and you see that it is.
Yeah.
But for example, if you're painting the landscape, meaning, look, and I think that this is really helpful. Sorry, let me do it again. Sorry. I mean, because I think this will become important in later discussions.
Don't include this picture in your next presentation, JP.
Like, this is crucial. Like, imagine you have, so we have here a world, and we have here a multiple alpha, a multiple beta, and a multiple gamma. What he's saying is that there is another multiple, which we call transcendental. It is composed of things like P and Q, right? So these are all in the world. These are not, a T is a multiple in the world. So for example, an identity, what he's saying is that, for example, an identity measure like this will give a value P, an identity measure like this will give a value Q, but it's relating multiples in the world, right? So let's say that the order structure here is defined, for example, by visual relations, color relations, meaning it doesn't include aspects of the multiple that concern sound, right? Because you're painting, right?
Yeah.
So
this is what I'm getting at. Yes.
Yeah. So it's not a matter of, this is not what he defined. What he was saying is that to arrive at the, let's say gamma here concerns the, I don't know, gamma is the motorcycle, and you're trying to think the connection between all of this and other stuff here, this region of the world, and this sound you heard. So you need to search now to make this identity in this world a value that is higher than, let's say, P and Q, and find a different value. That's the envelope, right? It's different from saying that something is not in the transcendental. It's not a degree there. And I think that it gives you a very kind of clearer materialistic sense of what he means by scale, because if you're painting, you're literally coming up with a space that is now separated from as a multiple, even though it's included, right? Painting is in the world that you're painting. It's part of colors and so on, but it's taking on the function of a transcendental. And in that case, the sound doesn't count. Its value is nil for the world of painting, that landscape. Yeah. For somebody who's just a transcendental is, I don't know, just relates to how you contemplate the landscape, then sound will be included, but it might require an envelope for you to measure or evaluate it in relation to other stuff. But it's different for something to be outside or not be part of a scale, and for something to be disjunctive in the scale, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry.
But I think what JP said was important, because you were discussing something else. You were discussing that.
Where do I get to share my screen again? Oh, okay. Yeah. Oh, sorry, guys. Go on, Red.
You were discussing that the transcendental is a partially ordered set. Mm-hmm. You are not talking about the world that, if we go back to, well, never mind. In the outer diagram, which is the world, there is an inner diagram.
Yeah,
there is an inner set or inner being or inner multiple, which we call transcendental. When he says partially ordered set, he's not talking about the outer one. He's talking about the transcendental itself, right?
this is let's read off this page and we see, because most of this is I took from his text, so I mean I paraphrase it, but it is what he said. So I think we can get to the bottom of this. Let's see. So operational closure, like results from that, right? The idea of operational closure is important in order to stave off some misunderstanding. Firstly, a world, an objective phenomenology or situation in ontology, which is interchangeable up to a point, is not an empty vessel wherein contents are poured. A world has its consistency immanently derived by the operations carried on by the relationship between the multiples that are said to consist in it. That means a world is constituted by its transcendental, which stems from the degrees of identity between multiples that might be said to consist in it. That also means that a multiple in its being ontology can participate in multiple worlds wherein it acquires different transcendental degrees concerning its relationship to other multiples in the concerned worlds. In formal terms, operational closure expresses itself as an ordered structure between degrees of identity of its multiple. This ordered structure results from three properties that should be present in the relationship between the elements of a multiple that is a world: reflexivity, transitivity, and antisymmetry, which is, the order, the definition of an ordered structure. Like a different, if you had symmetry, you'd have equivalence. With antisymmetry, you have an ordered structure, right?
So he's talking
that
about
being said,
these operations. These operations belong to the transcendental, not the world itself. So in this case, what I'm saying is X, Y, and Z here are not multiples, like are degrees of appearing of multiples.
You're right. I agree. So yes, these are degrees of appearance. So the ordered structure is between degrees of appearance of multiples. Yes.
So
yes.
Then what we call partial order or a posset is the transcendental itself. We are not talking about the entire world to be a posset.
Yes. Only that thing I mentioned, only in the drawing, the transcendental part, the set with the degrees, it has a order structure.
Can you draw it again? We loved it.
So don't tempt me.
You don't need any tempting.
True.
Yeah,
okay.
I'm having a problem imagining that the transcendental, of course, in the formal sense, you get to because there is a function from the transcendental to every object or object. We are not there yet, right? To every multiple in the world, of course, there is a set wherein you have functions coming in and out, right? So in a sense, it is a thing. In a very broad sense, it is a thing of the world, the transcendental itself. But I'm having trouble imagining that the partial ordering belongs in the set of the transcendental and not in the set of the multiples that are measured by the transcendental. Because it seems to me that there are two ways to understand this. One, the set of the transcendental degrees is partially ordered itself, right? So it's not that everything is bounded. There are some values that are unbounded, it seems. They are outside of the order structure. It's partially ordered. And the second way of understanding this is that the world, the multiples that are measured by the functions carried from the transcendental set, these functions are these functions have a partial order, not a complete order, not a total order. The functions are partially ordered. It's not like you have like a collection of transcendental degrees, or in some degrees are not ordered, but the functions are either totally ordered or partially ordered. I think he's saying that the functions are partially ordered. I don't know if you get the difference that I'm trying.
Well, yeah, I mean, a partially ordered set is always certain elements and a relationship. So relationship is that function. So depending on how that relationship defines values or how that relationship orders that set, then you call that set either a totally ordered or partially ordered. Like for example, if for example you have a set of 5 elements, 5 objects, right? That is basically comprised of 2 or 3 rudimentary objects, such as a watch and a lamp and a table, and then 2 letters, X and Y, right? And then you have the relation of heavier than, right? Mm-hmm. This is obviously a partially ordered set, because you can say a lamp is heavier than the watch and the table is heavier than the lamp, but you cannot say X and Y is heavier than the lamp or heavier than the watch, because there is no such a relationship between that object, which is X and Y, and the lamp. So it's a partially ordered set. So I see. It's always the relationship of objects and relations, a particular relation.
In a sense, we are saying the same. I think I'm just thinking, like, maybe because of my background, I'm kind of wary of, you know, presupposing that there is a transcendental, a collection there already, you know, like with all the non-ordered items and all that. What I'm trying to say is that it seems to me that the partial order results from the fact that there are multiples in this world that don't get to be measured within the same scale. So this is why you have a partial order, not a total order. Like there are some multiples that get to participate in the same, you know, the same, even though they are in the same world, the same transcendental, they get to participate in the same, let's say, criteria of measurement, while others don't, right? So my question was, do we have the degrees? Is the set of the degrees like defined beforehand as a partial ordering, or does it get defined through the relation to every other multiple in the world, and you by inspection you see that it is a partial order?
No, look, I think you just need to realize that partial order is a weaker definition rather than total order. Total order is a case, a possible case.
Yeah, of course, yes. It is.
So, I mean, if you don't want to say anything about a world specifically, you just want to have the broadest concept of order, partially ordered allows you to have trees of relations where some aspects of those trees are not connected directly.
Yeah.
So it's a broader concept of order. It's not, let's say, a quality of a given specific order. It's a higher, let's say, a weaker, more generic notion.
Okay, you're saying, yeah, I see. Like in other words, like the Heyting algebra is to the classic world. Like it is an ampler thing. It is a more generic thing that can.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And second, I think that, I mean, I understood you asked 2 questions. First, why partial, not total? Isn't that a decision? Isn't that implying something about structures in the world? And I don't think it is. On the contrary, it's giving a step back and saying, depending on specific scales and measurements, you will get some worlds that are totally ordered, some worlds that are broader and have other relations, and that's what a partial order will guarantee. Another thing is to ask, when we talk about order structure, are we talking about the transcendental or about the world in general, which I think is something else you asked. And I think that being a set with an order structure is what makes something a possible transcendental, right? So if the units in a ruler weren't in chains in a certain way that you accumulate from one to the other, and when I say 2 units, I'm implying the conjunction of one unit and another. So it's because a ruler respects a certain order structure, they could be a measure. So we're not presupposing measure. We're constructing what a measure is in a very broad sense. Given a world, or given a domain, I like differing domain from world, because let's say we have a domain without a transcendental, it's not a world. So given a domain, if there is in that domain a multiple, which is composed in a certain way, meaning it's ordered in this poset style, then that world will contain something that can measure itself. That can be many things. It doesn't mean that there's one, doesn't mean that it's always the same way, that it's partial or not total, but it's just, let's say, I think that a lot is hidden in that minimal function of a period, because when he says that the transcendental set is in the world, he's saying, he's now giving a bit more meat to the idea that when you evaluate things in a world, you don't localize them somewhere else. You localize them in that world. It's the I mean, it's but, you know, for me the craziest thing.
Yeah.
Right, and it's very experimental. Like, you don't get to know what relates to what in what level if you don't have means of evaluating immanently how those things relate. So heavier than, of course, we have a notion of heavier than that we can use ourselves as scale. And effort to raise something can be measured in that accumulative way that gives a certain order structure to ourselves as a scale. But if you actually, you need a physical scale of some sense to measure physical weight. And it will be a transcendental, meaning a multiple in a world that its own structure is such that you can localize in it the relation between things in that world. So it's a very materialist theory of measurement, where it's, you don't get to import from the outside that structure. You need to find it in there. And different scales will give you different stuff.
Yeah, I was thinking of an example where we can take the discussion you guys are having about, like, from what I understand, the question is like, where do these degrees come from, and like, how can we just assume that they exist? I think we can think of an experimental situation where you go to a place like a restaurant, and there are dishes. One dish for so there are different meats, right? There's chicken, beef, pork, and like tofu, right? In case you're vegetarian, right? So you have these different meats together, and it's a partially ordered thing because you can combine the beef and the pork to make a new dish, and you can say it's logically possible to say the beef and the pork together is better than the chicken. And I can also say the tofu and the chicken together, I can't really compare it with the beef and the pork. It's like they're just not related, right? And then you could say, oh, if you combine all four, it's like terrible, and so on. So you have this composition of meals that obeys the partially ordered, and then yes, you can use spices and so on. But I think the key thing here is that the degrees do not need to exist beforehand, but retroactively they must have been there for you to make those statements. Like, you can't make statements about relative, one is relatively better than the other, or one is actually spice is better, because with spices you can actually have different degrees of
you even have a degree of spicy.
Yeah, I'm trying to stay away from
there's an actual scale for this.
Yeah, like it doesn't have to be linear, so it can be salty, sweet, and so on, right? It's spicy. These are different. You can't really compare them on the same level, right? Something can be very spicy and something can be very sweet, but those are different scales that coexist together. So I think that partially ordered is like it's very experimental in that sense. You don't have degrees that exist in some like vacuum. They're discovered, at least in this kind of phenomenological, like individual experience example. The degrees were derived from concrete compositions of elements and then seeing how they compare to each other.
The way that I've understood this when Badiou was explaining was, again, related to the localization, and especially the use that he has from Plato and the conversation with him. Because if you remember in the previous section we were reading, he was saying that Plato is the first transcendental philosopher when he added the idea of other to what Parmenides was saying. He was saying that Parmenides had only one operator, and that was equivalence operator. But when we are talking about objects, objects have, on top of equivalence, in order for us to see or recognize the objects, we also need to understand the operator of the other, that something is other than another object. So the way that it goes into phenomenologically to a recognition of objects are their comparison and comparison of two objects together. So on top of the equivalence relationship, what in effect Plato has added to Parmenides is the comparison relationship. And comparison relationship is always, regardless of what that relationship is, like for example, the relationship of heavier or lighter or darker or spicier, or he doesn't say what this comparison relationship is. But once we get into comparison relationship, we are getting two things. One is we are getting two objects as opposed to one object, two entities. In order to understand one entity, you have to also get into the discourse with another entity. So it's always a relationship. And number two is always the result is a degree. And because of this, the answer is not always equal to. The answer is always more or less. So this object is different than that object by a certain degree. This is the way that I understand his discussion.
Yes, I think also you can get, we can further push our comment on Hegel from last time, because for Hegel, the debate between other, something is other to something else, but the other of otherness is this general other, right? Is this, let's say, you get to the self-difference in this general background. And in Badiou, you get actually something that is equally localized, right? So you don't get this, Hegel already suggests that the other of the other is not the one necessarily. Negation of negation is not a return to the same. But at the same time, you don't get that unrestricted other. You get a specific other, right? What is other to the relation between spices is, let's say, I don't know the mouth, but the taste buds or something, right? To which they are others. You don't get something out of the world, like, or the world itself. And I think, by the way, this is something, just to show how serious this is, that we moved from an example about painting a landscape to an example about tasting fish, to an example about a ruler measuring a wall and weights and things like this. We're at a level of discussion, measuring and evaluation, where experience and experimentation are equivalent, right? If you're talking about measuring it with a device that gives you, let's say, a degree or a relation or an ordering that arrives through sensation, through the means of perception that we have, or if you're talking about something that is measured and organized by a material scale or by a painting in a canvas, from the level where we're talking now, that makes no distinction. right? So in the, let's say, in the opposition between experience and experimentation, where experience supposedly concerns how things happen for us, and how an experimentation, how they happen for a measuring apparatus. In this particular, from this particular perspective, these are not differences of quality. Experience is one thing, experiments are other, right?
So if we extend this a little bit more, can we say, along with the idea of experimentation, or the idea that this is very empirical, let's say, and also what Dennis said, that how can we just assume, how could we just assume that a special measurement exists or a special scale exists in every world? Where did we come up with that?
No, because they're equivalent. There will be a world.
No, I know, but I think I want to find a way to argue for it, that if we say the operators, the main operator, when you come from ontology to phenomenology, the main operator, along with the shift from Parmenides to Plato, the main operator becomes comparison as opposed to equivalence. Then there must be somewhere to, or some means, since words exist and since the phenomenology or recognition of objects within the world exists, so there must be a means within that world in order to effectively compare things together. So if that is there, then the measurement must exist. Can we say that?
Yeah, well, I don't know if this answers but I was thinking more about this tasting example, and because I think I'm a bit hungry today, that's why. I think, yeah, your taste is developed. It's a part of the world, right? Because it develops. It's a mixture of biological and cultural and personal contingency that you develop the taste that you have, right? But again, this example is misleading because it seems to suggest again another subjectivist, like it seems to rely on the subject that arranges these things. But we just have to take the materialist twist that everything that we're saying is subjective here is part of the world itself. So this biological, cultural, and personal contingent elements that form the degrees that we call your taste, these things are part of the world as well. So the world includes the construction of, let's say, the world of taste includes also the cultural, biological, and so on.
Yeah, but I mean, we can be more careful about that, because you can make a distinction there between, let's say, two separate things. First, let's say you have some congenital defects on your taste buds and you can't really taste sweetness for some reason. It's very likely that the way that you arrange the experience of taste will be very different, and you will then ascribe, let's say, meanings to these things in accordance to your cultural thing, which is something else, right? But those perceptive restrictions, they concern taste buds measuring flavors. How those degrees of evaluation are then themselves connected to some cultural thing, it's something that it comes from a second thing, right? We can at least distinguish, if you want. We can talk about, let's say, a more physiological, more immediately perceptive, but we can talk about this process, leaving aside the questions of, okay, for me, this is too spicy and that's not spicy enough. And then you get, or this is less spicy, that level of intensity of appearance, and then ask for, let's say, the particular meaning of handling a very spicy dish in your culture or in your particular niche. Like, that's a second question that you can add to the first. But was it more or less spicy? that first question, or a very basic phenomenological question of how these sensations are organized, it already implies a measure that is not yet that cultural one that you're talking about. Of course, you can, yeah, exactly, as I said, like the comparison is immanent, like taste concerns some level of chemistry, and the taste buds are also chemically active. That's why one thing measures the other. They are in the same world. You cannot skip that, right? What I just want to like really hammer this point home that I think is really important, that there is a qualitative level where things belong to the same world. And it's not because you're forcing them to, because they do belong to the same world. Like,
yeah, I mean, this is, I think, what I was trying to say, that it seems for Badiou like the, and I think he mentions that several times, that since words are possible, then what are the conditions of these possibilities? We know that in order for words to be possible, there must be an operator of comparison. And for the operator of comparison to be possible, there must be scales by which these comparisons have to be made. That's it.
That's it. I mean, scales do have that themselves a condition, which is, and he says this on the last paragraph of page 156. He says, like everything that is, the transcendental is a multiple, which obviously belongs to the situation of being of which it is the transcendental. So it's, the transcendental is not out of the situation and added to it. It's
Yeah, absolutely.
just
it is
contingently there must be a multiple in a situation that is able to act as a transcendental because of its order structure, right?
Yeah.
So there is, let's say, there are interesting questions about the being of a multiple that can function as an order, as a scale, which is that it's being, so it's absolute relations, right? It's absolute characterization implies a certain ordering. That's why I meant that the ruler has a certain, the being of the ruler, insofar as parts of its extension relate to the whole of its extension in a certain way. That's, let's say, in the being of the ruler, it has certain properties, or certain properties, but it has certain structure. And that's why it can function as a way to measure extension in general, right? If you have like a bunch of small pieces that are of different sizes and they have no relation between themselves, you would need another ruler to see how they relate in terms of size. If they don't present that relation, you wouldn't use it as a measure for the size of a wall. So there is, let's say, a way to present scales as a contingent thing. It happens that there are, and it doesn't need to be natural in any sense or physical. For example, the world of images is, the domain of images online is boundless. And some communities organize these images in ways, basically, like I've been following this recently, cringe-worthy. Like some images are more cringy than others. Some videos online are embarrassing as fuck, others are less embarrassing. You created a scale. Now there is the world of
Cringe-worthy.
Of the cringy vibe. You can compare new images to that scale, let's say, because you organize them, for example, in terms of viewing or some level of. So
yeah, what I think is important, I think it's for somebody from another philosophical persuasion, I would say that the transcendental must be there in the world. It is because the status of all the multiples that are in the world is neutral in a sense. So everything that has a function within a world is there. Because, from a philosophy of language perspective, there is a danger in reifying something like, the transcendental degrees that are there, like some ghostly thing that is given,
Yes.
But the point is
for
that
me, I mean,
Yeah, but they're not given
trying,
as degrees. They're given as a multiple.
Yeah. This is what
So,
I'm
for
getting.
example, from the
I'm trying
standpoint
to
of
compatibilize. I'm trying to compatibilize this with my background in Solaris and particular
but you want to see an example of how this is the case. Like we're painting the house, okay? The canvas functions as the sort of evaluation of what counts and what doesn't count and how it counts and so on. Suddenly somebody wants to break into your house. You want to defend your house. Now the perimeter of the house is no longer the thing being evaluated, but the thing evaluating, because how close or far people are from the wall is relevant. Yeah. So there is nothing intrinsically ontologically about being scales or not. But for example, if you live like, I don't know, outdoors with no walls, perhaps protecting the perimeter will be harder because your house doesn't really offer that sort of degree structure, that ordering structure that would allow you to say closer or further away from my house.
Yeah.
So outside or inside.
I tend to think of this transcendental degrees in order to compatibilize with the framework I'm more used to. Because as I've been saying, one of the theoretical problems with philosophy of language sometimes is the fact that once you get to the critique of the myth of the given, you may slide into full-blown idealism, because it seems that there's no consistency other than what theoretical frameworks can offer. This is a problem. I'm not espousing this. I think this is a problem with that. There's a danger when you critique the idea of direct realism, this kind of thing, to slide into this kind of fiat kind of theoretical frameworks. So what I think is useful for me, for my project, what I think is very interesting, and it has something to do with the way I read Hegel's chapter on measure as well, is that I think of the transcendental as a kind of a placeholder for possible degrees. Like the actual degrees, when you assign a degree, they may be, in a sense, dependent upon other things. Like, for instance, if you assign a scale that is a numerical scale, well, it seems to be dependent to a mathematical practice, a scientific practice. Is not something given. You have to do it. But the fact that you can do it is inscribed within a world because it has a transcendental. This is the way I read this. So the transcendental there's this relationship to the traditional, Kantian concept of the transcendental, because the transcendental is a condition of possibility for measuring, in a sense. And
okay, so we can let's say we can separate the idea of evaluation as an action and measure as a sort of structural relation. So I would agree with that statement.
Like that. Yeah.
Can I ask for a point of clarification?
Sure.
Just like in terms of, I might be missing context here, but being able to compare things, it seems like you get like an ordering there, or like a partial order, but that doesn't necessarily give you like a full measure in terms of like quantifying something.
Yes, exactly.
Giving it a magnitude. So like in the case of measure here, like, is it just kind of this like ordering, or is there like something else that gives like a full like magnitude measure?
Yeah, I think that it's a good point that you asked, because as I said before, like, we're at such a level of abstraction where that there is an order structure doesn't mean it is, let's say, numerically quantifiable. Like the example Dennis gave of, I feel like this is more spicy than something else. You wouldn't learn anything more by giving numbers to spiciness. Like, this is 99 spice, that 98. Okay, but the core measure there is more or less spicy. So we're not, let's say, by talking about scales as partial orderings, we're not necessarily committing to, let's say, what will be the sort of magnitude that will express that relation, right? But we're giving, let's say, we're a step before. That's why experience and experimentation are so close together here. Measure in terms of sensation and measure in terms of an apparatus for coding numerically something, you know, or something like this. We haven't even gotten to that distinction, right?
Yeah.
So
Thanks for the clarification.
But does that help?
Yeah. And then I guess it makes me wonder, like what else is necessary to get to that? But I don't know if maybe that comes up later, to actually like going from that just ordering to some way of,
this is a great question,
doing.
because, for example, I think it was one of the most interesting and underexplored aspects of Badiou's ontology is that he gives you very nice broad framework to twitch with the variables and get, for example, the relation between mechanical systems, the way that we measure things in physics, like in classical physics, and prediction. Because if you have phenomena that are organized in a certain way, that will be like transitive relation, like iterations, or how do you call it, recursive functions, right? You can let's say measure them with this total ordering. Whereas if you moved in a certain certain axis, like 2 steps, that implies that you measured 1, and there's a linear measuring, right? There's a whole kind of interesting development to be made in terms of how do you restrict this very broad frame that he already develops in being an event, and that's at stake here, to get, for example, scales that render intelligible mechanical relations. And if you have a total ordering, which this transitivity and this recursivity implies, you're able to talk about future appearances, because you already have the total ordering of it, right? You know the value of appearance of something in that scale. So you can actually, let's say, restrict the things we're talking about to get, let's say, classical examples of prediction, of why certain numerical relations are interesting to evaluate certain things, whereas they're not really useful when we're talking about other sorts of world and things like this. So I think there's a lot there to explore that nobody did yet.
Yeah,
so in a way, is that
continue?
Yeah, I think we have beaten this to death, this horse.
Sorry, man, I don't know your name, but if you want to ask the question on the chat window, we can continue while we move on as well.
So, well, transcendental operations, minimum, conjunction, and envelope, the 3 first that he presents. So he starts saying, we will call appearing that which of a mathematical multiple is caught in a situated relational network world, such that this multiple comes to being there, or to status of being in a world dependent on it. It is then possible to say that this being is more or less different from another being belonging to the same world. We'll call transcendental operational set, which allows us to make sense of the more or less of identities and differences in a determinate world. Okay, we already discussed this for half an hour, so let's go. But a complete account of this localization of appearing beings, or beings there, is given by 3 operations: the existence of a minimum, the conjunction between different transcendental degrees, or between the transcendental degrees that are associated with 2 multiples of the world, and C, the possibility of synthesizing the values of appearance of an indeterminate number of multiples, even if the number is infinite, which is the envelope. From these 3 operations, we can derive operations pertaining to the degree of dependence between one multiple and another. Okay, so let's go on. Minimum. So he defines the minimum. We therefore posit that the transcendental T of any situation implies a minimum for the order that structures T. Let us call this minimum mu. We are dealing with an element such that for every element P of T, we have mu lesser or equal than T. Mu is lesser than every element P of T, like it's a minimum. The uniqueness of the minimum degree stems from the axiom of antisymmetry. Badiou's demonstration of this uniqueness goes like this. Suppose that mu and, how do you say that in English? We say in Portuguese, mu linha, line.
Mu
like
prime.
Prime, okay. Suppose that mu and mu prime are both minimum. It follows by the definition of the minimum, which is to be inferior to every other element of the transcendental, that mu is lesser than or equal to mu prime, and mu prime is lesser than or equal to mu. The axiom of antisymmetry demands that mu and mu prime be the same, or that mu equals mu prime, which is akin to reaffirming the axiom itself. What differentiated symmetry from antisymmetry would be expressed as the proviso that if a certain relationship between A and B obtains, and the same relationship between B and A obtains, A and B must be equal, which is in contradistinction to the symmetry axiom, which took the invertibility of the relationship as valid for any cases. The minimum is a degree of non-apparition. Right? So it's not well. It states that the minimum is like bordering the apparition, like something that is a degree of non-apparition. It's not a non-appearance sometimes, depending on the transcendental endpoint, right? Conjunction then, given the measure of the intensity of appearance, that is of the differentials of appearance of two beings, which are there in this world, we ascertain the intensity of appearance of that which is maximally common to them in the world in question. In order for the transcendental to operate in this direction, it is simply necessary that, given two degrees of its order, there always exists a degree that is immediately enveloped by the two others, that is, the greatest degree that the two others simultaneously dominate. The conjunction translates in a formal language the idea that there is something common between appearances in a world. This translates formally as the value of the transcendental T, which is the biggest value that is both inferior to multiple P and to multiple Q, the conjunction of which we are seeking. For any partial order structure, in this case for a transcendental T, this idea can be realized in the following way. Given two elements P and Q of T, that is two transcendental degrees, are you listening? It says here that my internet connection is unstable.
No, I can hear you fine.
For any POS, in this case for transcendental T, this idea can be realized in the following way. Given two elements P and Q of T, that is two transcendental degrees, we suppose that there always exists an element written as P conjunction Q, like the sign of intersection, right? Which is the greatest of all those which are lesser than both P and Q. In other terms, if R is lesser than P and R is lesser than Q, lesser than or equal to, right? We have on the one hand, conjunction P and Q is lesser than P, and conjunction P and Q is lesser than Q. P, yeah, this is the natural, between the parentheses, this is the natural language version. So, and on the other hand, R is lesser than P conjunction Q. P conjunction Q is greater than or equal to every R that has this property. If such a P conjunction Q exists, we say that is the conjunction of P and Q. So there is this proposition P0, which this is something I would like to verify, but I didn't have the time. Like sometimes I was kind of I was having trouble localizing the operative actuality of the proposition P0, which states within a comparison between degrees of appearance P and Q, if P is lesser and or equal to Q, then the conjunction P and Q equals P. So the conjunction seems to be always equal to the lesser value of both. This result will be used often. Okay, but you give as an example of this the relationship between the red foliage of the ivy and the ivy as a whole of first part of book 2. In the example, the red foliage is lesser than the ivy as a whole, and their conjunction, what they have in common, is the red foliage itself, here in the position of P of the formula. If you want to see other examples, there's check page 162 for remaining examples. So this is just to make intuitive the idea that the conjunction between two different transcendental degrees, the proposition P0 equals the lesser one, right? Because it seems that there is a degree of dependence of the red in the foliage towards the ivy as a whole. So the conjunction between the red and the ivy as a whole will be the red, right? That thing that they have in common. So the conjunction and the envelope make explicit a net of dependencies between the entities of multiples of a world. And
there is a kind of to make it clearer, there is a kind of mereological correlate, right? Where the conjunction of a part and the whole, the thing that a part and the whole have in common is the part.
Yeah, of course.
Right. Yeah, that's what that statement means.
Yes.
And as Danny says, the only case where that is not true.
It is weirder. Yeah, it is weirder when you compare two things that are not part one of the other, you know. So
and that's what Danny said. Yeah. So P0 has a condition, which is given that they are related, then it will be the part for the whole, the conjunction.
Where is it?
He says on the chat.
Okay.
If they are not related, then to find their common points, you'll have to go to the lower degree below both of them.
Oh, okay. Yeah, this clarifies. I was having trouble with the P0. This issue. Okay.
Yeah, I think that this is a better way of understanding it, and I also think that, I mean, at some point somebody could go into this. It's such a nice thing because there is a generalization here of Bull's own use of mereological relations to talk about logical dependence in his Laws of Mathematical Thought, like this fundamental book, because he uses this sort of, right? Let's say if A is part of B and B is part of C, therefore A is part of C, right?
Yeah.
He makes that sort of correlation between parts and wholes to give us, let's say, a diagrammatic presentation, not diagrammatic, but like a almost set-like presentation of logical relations. That's how he formalizes logic there, right? Implication. And Badiou is doing something similar, but it doesn't really require like these classical restrictions, because the way we're talking about here, you can have, for example, A not belonging to B, B belonging to C, and then you want to ask about the relation between A and C, and you need to go to the underlying multiple to which A and C belong to find their common ground. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, find the territory for the conjunction.
There you go.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Daniel. I mean, this was something that I think I missed this further condition for the P0 because I was really baffled because there are some results that doesn't give us that, and I was, well, it's not for every example that this is the case, right? So yeah, there you go. So envelope. The intuitive phenomenal idea, which we outline above, is to express through a single intensity the entire intensity contained by a fragment or part of a world. I think this is related to our discussion of vibe. Last time we were discussing the vibe of something, or the Stimmung, what Heidegger would say is the Stimmung, or the vibe, the ambience, the atmosphere of a landscape, or something like this. The overall transcendental degrees that kind of subsumes every other, right? So the intuitive phenomenal idea.
Just before you go on, like, you know, an interesting question would be if Stimmung and estimate have the same etymological origin.
Well, yeah, that's actually a good question.
Yeah, isn't it? Like from this perspective, it would be useful to find that out. But yeah, sorry.
Yeah, that's good. Okay. The entire intensity contained by a fragment or part of the world, but also to express it with the greatest precision, to grasp this sum of intensities as closely as possible. It is a matter of finding the intensity of appearance of an element that envelops, this is the term we propose, the global appearance of the part in question, or again, to establish the degree of appearance immediately greater than that of every element contained by this part. So let M be a world and T its transcendental. Consider the subset B of the transcendental, which represents all the intensities of appearance of the fragment of the world in question. If S is part of M, is S, which is a part of M, is this fragment, this finite or infinite part of the world. And if T is the transcendental of this world, B, which is a part of the transcendental, will be that part of the transcendental which contains all the measures of intensity of appearance for the elements of the part S. Okay. I really don't know how to make this. I mean, it's clear enough if you read like slowly, I suppose. Let's suppose that there exists at least one element T of T.
Sorry, just before you go on, a good way of thinking about this that he doesn't mention is that conjunction is a bit like metonymy, and envelope is a bit like metaphor.
Also,
like metonymy has that structure of taking the whole for the part, right? Sorry, taking the part for the whole. And metaphor has that idea of you can't really find the direct relation, and you come up with a sort of broader whole to include both things. Like this is like, then you add this added extra thing to give it some measure, right?
Yeah, like you find something that is capable of synthesizing.
A relation that is not given directly.
So this is why the conjunction is the analysis and the envelope is the synthesis, right? So the conjunction is the bigger value below the multiples being conjoined, and the envelope is the smaller value above the multiples that you are investigating, right? It's the smaller that is above them. So it's kind of the concept. Sorry, Reza?
I don't see the relationship between metonymy and metaphor, because conjunction is the part. You're not taking the conjunction for any of the I mean, what Gabriel is saying, if P is part of Q, but conjunction in general does not make an assumption that P is part of Q or not.
Conjunction doesn't make the assumption that P is part of Q.
Like I think Reza doesn't see the relationship between conjunction as such and that.
And I don't think it works generally. I agree. I'm not saying that those are the same thing.
Okay.
Just
to distinguish the two.
Okay. Maybe. It's a heuristics in a sense. I mean, because I think conjunction points to the degree that is below, right? And
it's common between two.
And the envelope is the lower degree that is above.
Yeah, to which they are common. So conjunction is the thing that's common to both. Envelope is the thing to which they're both common.
To which they are common. This is good. Yeah, exactly. So then it goes on. Let's suppose that there exists at least one element T of T which is larger than, greater than, or equal to all the elements of B. In other words, if B belongs to B, little b belongs to the set B, then B is lesser or equal to T. We will say that T is an upper bound of B. For instance, we can imagine that the atmosphere of the autumn evening, already seized by the luminous rupture which opposes the shadows to the red splendor of the wall, like the sign of the coming cold in the declining light of day, dominates all the ingredients of the fragments of the world in question. Accordingly,
I don't find his examples illuminating at all. It is more confusing. He should stick with formalization.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean,
dude, the guy just gave you like the general definition of a world. Let him have it, like his poetic moment, you know. He's full of himself. Yes,
that's why I like this book, the section on the mathematics of transcendental, a lot more effective than logics of words itself.
Yeah, but
should
it's
be reading
because
that
you're
book.
already sold on the Platonic thing. Like he needs to convince all the transcendental empiricists that he has a better grasp of intensity and sensation with this stuff than they have with their creative ontology. So I think that's also part of the reason why he chooses like this examples that definitely don't fit in.
I don't think is that far fetched. I mean, this one.
I really like this one.
I like this one. I have a really big problem with the opera one. I don't. Every time he goes back to that opera example, I'm completely lost. I don't
Remember
understand
that example?
why the one is bigger than the other. I have no idea what he's talking about with the opera example. Really.
Remember that example, the awful example he had in, I think it was in book 1, about love, and it was also an opera.
Yeah. It was, what was it? Yes, I remember.
It was such a bad example.
I don't like. But this one, if you think of it, I mean, kind of artistically, like the painting example is perfect. You are doing a painting, so you get to put different elements in your painting that you can assign to them a different transcendental degree or a transcendental a degree of intensity within the painting. Okay, so some spot has conjunctions to others. Some are parts of others, and all that. You have all of this structure that he's describing in your painting. So there is something that is kind of a summation, so to speak. I think it's not by chance that he uses the sigma, but anyway, there's a kind of a summation of the different degrees of intensity that give you an overall, let's say, an overall feeling.
Yeah, for example, we use this when we say, for example, I don't know, the world of, I don't know, Turner paintings. There is an idea, if you see enough Turner paintings, suddenly you look at a sky and say, fuck, this is such a Turner sky. Why? Because you learn to evaluate the degrees of appearance in a certain way because of those scales. He constructed a scale, right? A way of seeing. So I think that's, in that sense, this is why he needs such a broad idea of scale and evaluation and measure that is not, let's say, refined or generalizing scientific experimentation, right? Because he wants a notion of scale that you can then say things like this. Which I think are connected to what Dennis said before, that sensibility is trained, right? How you see can be trained culturally or whatever by the experience of these different experiments, artistic experiments, which are...
This is interesting because it can illuminate, for example, the concept of style or the concept of genre in the sense. Genre is more like you have certain explicit rules, but style, no. Style is something weird, something difficult to define. Nevertheless, you get to listen to piece A or B by same person, same composer, and you recognize it. The materials are different. The order of the materials is presented differently. The notes are different. The instrumentation is different. Everything is different, but you get to there is something going on that is common between these two different pieces. So I think envelope is something like that, right? Like something that enables the recognition of some transcendental degree of identity that is dependent upon all the little degrees of intensity that are present in something. So
now you guys probably have seen this in algebra, but does I haven't looked at the formal definition in Heiting. Is Heiting using the same terminology like envelope?
No.
What does he use for this operation?
I think they talk about conjunction, union, and things like this, like more classical logical terms.
But envelope is not union.
Yeah, but I don't remember now. Let me see. I can even check for you.
That's fine. I'll look it up.
It is effectively the same as union.
Yeah.
It's just a union that is n-ary. It can take as many inputs, whereas union is normally a binary operation. But envelope is just an n-ary version.
Yeah, this is what he says after. He says if you have two multiples, the envelope is the union of them both. Even but
exactly.
You're actually right. And envelope is union. Because if you have two sets, the union of two sets is the minimum set that is inclusive of both sets.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
This is the idea. The lower degree that is above the degree of the multiples being.
I think besides the logics of Badiou's metaphor, somebody at some point should write a book on Badiou's small twitchings of mathematical concepts. Like he never really just uses the concepts as they are in classical textbooks. He always likes to like change it a bit, you know.
Yeah, but this may be related to the fact that he maybe wants to present it as more his work than it is in a sense.
But why? I think first of all, for people who are taking this formalization really seriously, it would be a lot easier if you use the same terminology as Heiting algebra itself, as opposed to create terms that are not familiar. So that's number one. And the other thing is that he didn't do that in Being an Event. Well, he kind of did. He called
presentation, representation.
Yeah.
He gave a
but
new
this
name.
I think he inherited this from Lacan. Because Lacan's the king of taking stuff other people did and then making it really difficult. But there's a you could say if you wanted to defend it, you could say it's forcing you to think through it yourself.
Yeah, I agree.
Because if they just deliver you, oh, look at the Heiting algebra, then most of us would never do that.
And I think that also too, Badiou's merit is that he's a really good didactician of these things. Like you would never learn about Heiting algebra by just opening the textbook on topos theory or local theory or whatever it is. Like that he only gives you in the end, like, and this thing you just learned, it's what they call a complete Heiting algebra. I think that's part of his didacticism.
Well, I think if you want to argue against it, though, I get your argument that maybe a didactic slant to this. But if you want to argue against it, you kind of lose the whole heritage that probably Badiou wants to emphasize here, that how Heiting algebra is basically the algebra of the entire classical logic. I mean, there is a whole tradition behind that, which he kind of loses that tradition.
I don't know, because he mentions it.
He does. He has to mention it as if this is something that he invented it, but he didn't have to do it. I mean, this is an already established area of logic.
Yeah, I don't know. My opinion is that if I think I would do something similar if I had to present these things in a way that is compossible with philosophical and other procedural problems. Like to facilitate, let's say, it would be hard to use it in an example concerning political gathering, as he does later on. If you need to, let's say, first he already says that he's thinking the thought of mathematics, right? In the sense that he's recognizing something there that has a other significance that is not necessarily the one that in the practice of mathematics it has. So I think that he keeps a distance from it also to respect that distinction between mathematical thinking's own development in the history of mathematics and its import in a sort of ontological, phenomenological framework, which needs to be such that when you put it to use and to philosophical discussions, it flows easily, because that's where his commitments are, right? So I would say that the argument would go somewhere in that way, and that, I mean, I think it's a good effect that after reading these things, we become people who say, fuck the way he presented it. It's so clear we don't need it. Like, sure, but it's also, I mean, a bit of a rhetorical trick to make it easier for philosophical debate to absorb these things, I think, keeping that minimal distance from the actual terminology. But I agree.
And it's also, it is also interesting because it is honest in the sense that it assumes that there is a meta-ontological discourse going on. Like in being an event, there is all these vocabularies that he's mobilizing, which are the meta-ontological vocabulary of philosophy, in a sense, connecting the mathematical results to all these issues, right? So I think there's some. I was joking before that this is so in order to make him like avail himself of these concepts, like I did this, but this is more like a joke. I think there's an honesty to it in a sense, like I'm using this for this other thing, and there is the vocabulary, the meta-ontological vocabulary proper, that is not the same as the ontological vocabulary that is the vocabulary of set theory, for instance, right?
And I think other guys, like Robert Rosen, the guy I mentioned last time, he does the same thing. Like he comes up with, he finds certain structures he likes in category theory, and he says, look, we'll call this the anticipatory region of a system. Like nobody calls it that. It's just for his purposes, but it also kind of marks the distinction between this repurposing and how it would play into the development of
it's like that. There's an honesty in it in the sense that I'm repurposing it, I'm using it like this and all that. There's some kind of fit of the concept within a different region of application, different concept, a different context, right? So I think it's rather interesting.
Just before we move on, one thing that I think we should mention, just because we went so quickly through it, I think that the minimum is actually quite, I mean, the fact there is one minimum, it's a unique value, I think it was clear, but the necessity of a minimum, I think it's a very, very
important. It's very important.
Very important. The idea that, let's say, the being of a scale requires this.
It requires an absolute minimum.
For example, I don't know, for certain worlds of painting, the black canvas is a minimum, or it's the same as not being painted. Or for other worlds, the blank canvas is the minimum. Or for other worlds, the minimum is articulated differently. But you know, the idea that you have that this is essential, I think it's actually quite profound. It's not so simple as it's the least value.
I think it is important from the respect that for a posit there must be a minimum, otherwise it's not a posit. Like for example, that's why let's say real numbers is not a partially ordered set, because ordering does not work in real numbers because there is no absolute minimum.
Mm-hmm.
In order to be a posit, there must be an absolute minimum.
Yeah, but also he needs a degree of non-appearance, right? So because
which is that minimum.
He is a phenomenology. There is a minimum. Yeah.
Yeah, but what I think
he needs
Yeah, but this is crucial because otherwise you already get a distinction between, let's say, a degree of non-appearance in a transcendental, meaning that in the scale you have something that localizes what not doesn't appear. It's different from saying, let's say, something that is outside of the scale. Right? So I think it also contributes to the idea of closure of the.
Yeah, I think he wants to have a minimum degree because he wants to be able to assign such a degree to multiples. So it's different to say that the multiple is not there. Like, like you have a multiple that participates in several worlds, right? So like in a world it has certain transcendental degree P. In other world it has another transcendental degree. In another world it is not there in a sense. It's non-appearing. Like it receives a degree minimum. So I think he wants to be able to assign a degree to a multiple that ontologically might be there, but it is not there. I mean, it's not appearing in a world, or it is appearing with a minimum. He wants to be able to assign a degree for that. So this is why I think the minimum is important. It is also important because actually it's something that strikes me as interesting in the book is the fact that that whole discourse on negation is in the introduction of this second book. So he needs the minimum in order to have the reverse, right? I'm always getting a problem because of the French. He needs the minimum to get the reverse, which would be his non-P, right? His negation, like the region of the world that has the minimum degree in the conjunction with the region that I'm looking at the moment, right? So you have all which is non-P, all which is not what I'm looking at. So it has to receive a transcendental value that is equal to a minimum, like a non-appearing. So in a sense, it's in the formalism, it is a way to make appear the non-appearing, like make appear the negation, which was the problem of that introduction about the concept of negation, right? He went to, you remember Reza exposed it very well, like he went from Plato then to Kant and all of that. The meaning of the meaning of negation within a world. So the minimum is absolutely necessary for that, it seems.
Yeah, that is a very, very crucial thing to Badiou.
Okay.
So if the conjunction was the biggest transcendental value below the threshold of the values that compose the conjunction, we can say that the envelope is the minimum value above the threshold of the conjunction of values of a certain part P of the world. The relationship between envelope and a conjunction is captured by a distributive function to be exposed after, like the conjunction between a transcendental degree and an envelope, right? There's a distributive property. Let's now, that will be, the formulas will be there next pages. Let's now suppose that there exists an element U, which is the least of all the upper bounds of B. In other words, U is an upper bound of B. And if T is another upper bound of B, we have U lesser or equal to T. The world fragment B is a territory for U, and U is the envelope for B. This is written U equal sigma B. Okay. So the territory is the lower bound, right? Is what is below, and the envelope is what's above. So there's a territory for an envelope. B can be defined as a set of multiples that have some property in T. So yeah, this reads B is the set of the elements Q of T that possess the property P. In this case, the envelope of B will be written as U, Q that has the property P. We can then see very plainly that U is the element of T, which is greater than or equal to all the elements Q of T that have the property P, upper bound, lesser than or equal to every element T, which like itself is greater than or equal to all the elements Q with property P, least upper bound. A particular case is the envelope with only two multiples. This is the union that Dennis was talking about. I mean, here he uses the proper concept of union. Particular case is the envelope with only two multiples, P and Q, in which case the envelope is equal to the union of P and Q, since in a transcendental there exists the envelope of every subset B of T. It is obvious that the union of P and Q always exists.
So why should it be a special case?
Sorry?
Why should this be a special case?
Yeah.
Why can't we extend union among multiple sets? Or multiple degrees? So
yeah,
why
that's what envelope is.
Yeah, that's what he calls the envelope, the n-ary of union operator.
I think Reza is asking why is
he using union in a special case?
A difference in nomenclature. Yeah, like
but I mean, have you heard n-ary union rather than union? Like,
yeah, why not? Like n-ary conjunction.
Okay, if that rocks your boat. I prefer envelope than
actually
n-ary.
I think
no, but I think the question this is kind of getting weird.
Okay, but I think there is a special I think there is a special even notation of union, and we have it in axioms of set theory, that they put a U and then like sigma, and there is an n equal to n from 0 to infinity of U of all the elements. So yeah, I mean there is n-ary for sure. It has its own notation too.
Yeah, but I think this is just to envelope is more adapted to the phenomenological concept, it seems. I think the question is not so much. I think Reza is asking the opposite question of my question. I mean, why the union is not an envelope? But he says a particular case, the envelope with only two multiples. So the union is an envelope, but because he says that it is a union, maybe it can land the text can land to a reading wherein this is a super special case wherein it is not an envelope. No, it is an envelope, but the envelope of two with two multiples is a union. It's just that.
Yeah, it's just a little bit bizarre to me.
But what is bizarre? The fact that the envelope is not a union, or the fact
the fact of Badiou's taking an already established algebra.
Mm-hmm.
I get his formalization within, like you said, the language of meta-ontology within being an event, because he's making a philosophical use, a particular philosophical use of certain terminologies. So he doesn't say power set. He doesn't say power set. He says representation. I find that's fine, because that's a legitimate terminology, because he's using philosophical usage from it, the meta-ontological usage from it. But I don't find envelope such an example. But I may be wrong. Let's not dwell it here. I find union a lot more appropriate here than envelope. Especially he's using conjunction, and then for union he's using envelope.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't know what to say about that. Yeah. Okay.
In any case, I think that the crucial part there is not really the idea of envelope; it's the idea of territory, right? I think it gives more concreteness to the phenomenology of it, like the fact that there is an operation that is this sort of way of measuring the common region that includes these two lower degrees, right? And that this point, this U, that is a degree that measures the degrees of the relation of the degrees of appearance of P and Q, it's actually giving us the equivalent to measuring a region of the world that includes the appearance of P and Q. right?
Actually, comes to think of it, then I come back to my original point that envelope is, in this case, is not quite similar to union, because union is a set, but envelope is a degree. That's the difference. So
envelope
anyway,
is yeah, because here also sets and operations are in a certain sense equivalent. There is no such thing as the being of a function that is distinct from the output, right? So, but I think the really important thing is this idea that in the same scale, you will get both values for this localized parts and a value for the, let's say, this thing that envelops both localized parts. So for the region, right?
Yeah, no, the concept is clear. I mean, I had my original struggle with this when I read it the first time, I guess, years ago. It was, like you said, to distinguish between the concept of a set of degrees, which is the territory, and then the least upper bound of that set of elements, which is the envelope. In this case, envelope is like just a number or a degree or a scale. Is the least upper bound. It's not a set.
Yeah, but in a sense, a degree will be equivalent to a set, if I understand correctly here.
Degree is a number.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, no, it's a multiple.
It's a multiple. It's not a number. Yeah. That's relevant. That's a relevant distinction.
Yeah.
Numbers is that are multiples, not multiples that are numbers.
Well, numbers are multiples too, but
yeah, but not all multiples are numbers.
Okay. But not all multiples are numbers. But okay, it is actually, this is a very good point, that these multiples are multiples that are relevant to the comparison function.
Yeah.
So the comparison function somehow can use these numbers. Can use these multiples.
Exactly. But not all comparisons will have, let's say, the multiples that are numerical multiples as their best comparison scale. Yeah, so
not necessarily. I mean, that's completely true. So this is a very abstract, generalized framework.
Exactly. And I think that this point about distributivity is already a sort of interesting fact, because we, up to here, he formalized these basic operations, minimum, conjunction, and envelope. But distributivity is already something we get from this, right? So we're still very close to the primitives of Badiou's definition of world, because these three primitives are a requirement for a scale to exist: minimum, conjunction, and envelope. If you don't have these three things, you cannot say you have a scale, a multiple structured like a partial ordered set. But once you have this, the question is, what else do you have? And this property of distributivity of conjunction with regards to envelope and things like this is what we're getting for free if we accepted that. Right, those are
this distributivity is axiomatic too.
No,
there is. Yeah, it is
theoremic. You derive distributivity from these three properties.
No, there is no theorem. There is nothing within the definition of conjunction and envelope that allows for distributivity. It's an axiomatic.
Yeah, I agree with Reza here. If you go to this textbook on universal algebra, page 10, you'll see a chapter called distributive and modular lattices, and basically shows like not every partially ordered set supports a distributive operation.
Okay. So you don't get this for free, and that's why it's actually before the section on transcendental algebra, right? So it's also a condition for you to have a complete Heiting algebra. Is not something that you get because you have a complete Heiting algebra.
Yeah.
My bad.
It's something you have. It's a subset. It's something. It's a condition you have to add in order to have a complete Heiting algebra.
Yes. Okay.
Dennis sent that. I've read that somewhere else in a different way, but yeah, you already sent that. Well, man, you're always 2 steps ahead.
That's why I substituted QED for what Dennis said.
that was absolutely bang on.
Okay. So we have like 20 minutes. I have the feeling that we are not again finishing this today.
No, but we got basically we got to the definition if all the way to distributivity, right? Before reverse. Reverse is something we do get, right?
Yeah, reverse is something that we do get.
Yeah. So where we stop now with distributivity, we actually
reverse and dependence is something that we get.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I get. Yeah.
And distributivity is an axiomatic for a certain posits.
Yeah. No, yeah, but I mean, I just think we shouldn't skip this fact that with distributivity, okay, not before it, but containing it, we finish the sort of primitive conditions of a scale.
That's good.
And everything, yeah, but everything after this is something that we, let's say, follows from this, right? So transcendental algebra only needs to have this basic properties: minimum, conjunction, envelope, and distributivity, which are very broad, much broader than numerical comparisons, broader than the difference between a scale being a matter of sensation or being a measure of an apparatus, it being restricted into a total order or not. Like at that level of broadness, that's what we're having as our primitive framework. And we're gonna get we get a lot, let's say, out of it, right?
So should I go on, or what do you want to do?
I think you should go on. We should go on, finish reverse and dependence.
Okay.
And then we should go on
Maybe
till the classical worlds and
yeah, at least the ordinary logic part. Maybe I pick up from the ordinary logic and the
we could stop before the ordinary.
Yeah, something like that. Okay, so maybe I will skip one page of this because I really copied all the stuff, all the proofs. Maybe it's not that necessary. So the reverse of a being there is the envelope of the beings there of that region of the world that is disjoint from the initial being there. This is by the use reconstruction within objective phenomenology of the concept of negation. Let me get this cat out of it. This is by use reconstruction within objective phenomenology of the concept of negation, the appearing of negation, which is nothing less than the appearing of a minimal degree of identity between one region and another of a world. The degree Q disjoint from P is a degree. The conjunction with P is nil. The set of the degrees with this property of being disjoint from P is written. You get the formula there. Q, such as the conjunction of P and Q is nil. Okay. The envelope of this set, the smaller degree of the degrees that are bigger than the transcendental value of this set, is the envelope of Q, such that the conjunction of P and Q is mu. The resulting formula of the reverse of P is non-P, which amounts to non-P equals the envelope of Q, such that P and Q equals mu. So it is the world that has the part of the world that has the nil degree. This is
so again, with the mereological interpretation, we could say that negation is actually, let's say, negation supposes a totalization, right? I mean, we argued this when we first got through this part, when we discussed the conceptual chapter on Transcendental, that he makes a big fuss about his concept of negation, that is derived and not a primitive. But at the same time, he does keep a sort of Hegelian flavor to it, because to negate implies to totalize, right? There is, let's say, the relation between synthesis and negation, which was important for Hegel, right? Negation and conceptualization. There's all this complex dialectics between you negate something and you get the totality of what you negated and things like this. You preserve this even if you don't assume it as a primitive, right? Because it's part of, let's say, if you decompose the reverse into conjunction and envelope, you get the envelope of everything that has new conjunction, new degree of conjunction with the thing being negated, right?
Yeah.
Oh.
Okay. There are. Should I read this? I mean, these are just formulas. I mean, these are the formal consequences of the reverse. I just copied them in. It's kind of difficult to present this chapter because, you know, it's kind of tautological. But okay. So,
yeah, but I don't think we need to go through all the formulas. I think it's just the point, like the facts that you get from this. The other consequences are useful to know.
Yeah, the conjunction of a degree and its reverse is always equal to the minimum. So you had a formula that is equal to the minimum, which is mu, right?
Yeah, I mean, what something has in common with its negation is the null value. The negation of a negation
does not give the affirmation.
Yeah, does not necessarily give the affirmation.
Not necessarily. The negation of the negation does not necessarily give the affirmation. But the reverse of the reverse of a degree is always greater than or equal to the degree itself.
Yeah, but the opposite is not true.
But yeah.
It is not the case that the reverse of a degree is less than or equal that degree.
Yes.
Yeah. So the second formal consequence is important since it points in its foundation the classical logical conception of the double negation of P is always equal to P, right? Which will be a condition for the law of double negation will be a condition for the classical world.
Yeah, but I think that, I mean, it suffices for us just to realize that what follows from the definition of reverse doesn't commit us to a classical negation, right?
Yeah.
We can still arrive at it, but we're not. So we're still keeping a broader frame than a classical logical frame.
You can restrict it in order to give you a classical negation and to have a classical world. So classical world will be basically a world of two transcendental values, right? So this will be given in section 5 when he talks about the world of ontology. Okay.
You guys notice that when he gets to these points, he kind of like when he talks about the reverse of the reverse and the fact that reverse of the reverse is or the reverse is an envelope of all the
nil conjunctions.
Yeah, all the degrees that have nil value with the conjunction and stuff. He gives up on that wall and the IV and all that. He's not giving any more examples from that autumn.
No, he gave examples because we're Caron is going through the formal chapter, but in the conceptual chapter, right? We are on chapter 3 of the book on Transcendental.
The problem is
not in these parts.
The problem is that the example is that fucking opera, so I don't understand the example. It's just the main problem with this. But
okay.
No, it's like clearly here. Look, the conjunction of Ariadne and the reverse Aladdin is reduced to mere tears. Of course, it's clear.
Yeah. It's obvious.
No, but this is crucial. No, look. I can make this clear. Which is the fact that you don't get.
Draw something for us to make this clear.
No, this is crucial, man. This is actually crucial because otherwise, the negation of, for example, in a play, the negation of a character, like of a certain relation, the negation of that negation. So you have this sort of character there is at the extreme opposite in terms of their relations to some other character. If negation of negation equated the first term, the localization of that negativity would have to be the relations themselves, right? The negation of Ariadne's cluster of relations is Aladdin, whose relations are totally different. The negation of Aladdin would have to be Ariadne herself. So the same relation. So nothing new would appear. But the fact that you need a new scene with different relations for them to be the degree of appearance of that negation of Aladdin. You see my point? Like, I'm not sure if it's clear. It's not as clear as saying it's reduced to mere tears, but the point that you need a scene of somebody crying to express the value of negating Aladdin and not simply going on with the character as it is. Like, it needs to add something.
No, I don't understand at all. Sorry.
Okay, so I failed in my. I will come up with a better American Pie example, but for now, I'll read. I just think that if you think in these terms, that negations don't necessarily, the negation of negation doesn't appear as the terms you already have. It appears as it can appear as an added thing.
We get that, but you know, for me, in order to understand the example, it's much easier for I use the conceptual thing in order to understand the example, not the other way around. That's my point.
Yeah.
I think you are in the same boat too, Gabriel.
Yeah, this example is not, I mean, I'm having, what's the negation of pork? It's a palate cleaner. Like, you know, like when you have that.
Like wasabi.
Like wasabi can be, like, depending. Yeah, man, that's a good idea. That's a good idea.
Yeah, it's like that meme, you know, my brain is exploding now. Wasabi, I get it. Sorry.
Now I get.
You're joking,
now I get hating.
But I mean, I swear there is some truth to this.
Now I get hating. Now I get hating algebra. Wasabi, why didn't you say that earlier?
Yeah, but there is something to this. The idea that the appearance of the disjunction, that is the reverse, right? That particular sort of totalizing disjunction is not the thing that was disjunct. If you want to negate the set of the disjunctive region, you won't get back the value of its opposite, of its partition, or whatever you want to call it.
That is absolutely true, but that's a mathematical explanation.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just trying to give. Yeah, okay.
The problem is the example. I mean,
the problem is not the concept. The concept is clear. The problem is that you actually use the concept in order to understand the example, but that's not the way it's supposed to be. The example is supposed to illuminate the concept, but in this case, it's just the opposite.
Yeah.
Okay. Like I kind of like. I think Reza doesn't like, but I kind of like the autumn landscape. The autumn landscape. I understand, you know, the P0.
No, I like it. Actually, I like. It's not that I don't like it.
The envelope, I like this. I mean, what's the opposite? I mean, the reverse is kind of difficult. What's motorcycle? I don't remember. Is the motorcycle a reverse? Really?
No, he says, yeah, the motorcycle, the sound of the motorcycle.
What's a motorcycle?
No, he does say that the sound of the motorcycle in that scenario, it kind of distinguishes this region of everything that is disjunct from it. So you could say that it is everything that includes the sound of the motorcycle is negating, right?
Okay. Yeah, I think it's clearer than, you know, the relationship between Ariane and Aladdin towards Bluebeard. I think the motorcycle is clearer.
I don't know. I wish he actually used musical examples. I think it would be clearer, but
musical examples.
Okay, should we continue?
Yeah, let's continue. Okay.
No, I think we should really watch the whole filmography of David Lynch and get all the examples from there. I think this will be like a textbook explaining Logics of Worlds with David Lynch. This will be a great project.
Just a companion to Logics of Worlds with better examples.
just examples. We give the formulas and then you know. Okay, so
he really builds worlds.
What? Sorry.
I'm just saying, David Lynch really builds worlds.
Yeah, for sure. I think who said that? Sorry, I didn't see.
Oh, that was me, Yasha, Troy.
Okay. Yeah, no, because this is an ongoing conversation we had. Like at some point, somebody suggested that David Lynch kind of intuitively, of course, this is of course a general framework for describing what a world is, but there are kind of interesting motifs in David Lynch that makes, for instance, the reverse or the envelope very, I mean, much clearer because of the weirdness of the things that are going on, you know. So all this business about partial ordering, unbindedness of a motive within a certain transcendental that requires an envelope. This was my point with the Lynchian example. I really do think that there's something here that might illuminate the technique, the storytelling technique. But anyway, it's just
Yeah, that sounds really interesting.
Joke, but yeah, it's almost an internal joke of us. But at the same time, I think it got a transcendental degree of seriousness. But anyway, okay.
Okay, but let's try to.
Let's go through this.
No, this is the end. No dependency. Yes. Oh my God. Okay.
We didn't discuss the maximum.
For every degree. Sorry?
Yeah, the maximum.
Yeah, the maximum. Let's go. So we wish to establish for every degree P of the transcendental T whose minimum is mu, that the degree P remains lesser than or equal to the reverse of mu, that is non-mu. In other words, whatever P that's in the transcendental may be, we need to have a P that is lesser or equal than non-mu. Hence, non-mu is the envelope of a Q whose conjunction with mu equals mu, which is the definition of negation. But as we have seen, one of the obvious properties of mu is that for every Q, we have a conjunction with mu that is equal to mu. The value of the conjunction with 0 is 0. It follows that non-mu is the envelope of a transcendental T as a whole, or non-mu equals the envelope that is the envelope of a transcendental.
I didn't think of this. I don't know why I didn't think of this before, but having a maximum does not mean that the transcendental as a multiple itself is bounded, is it? Or is finite?
No, it doesn't mean that it's finite. No.
Yeah.
But it does mean that it is not that it is bounded. Yes, bounded but not finite.
It's bounded but not finite.
You mean you can have a value that is not a finite value for the envelope of T. This is what you mean.
It means that there could be infinite degrees within the transcendental.
Yeah. But there is such a thing as a maximal degree. This is really profound. Yeah, because of the, phenomenology, and he says this on the conceptual chapter at the end, that there is no, where does he say it's?
Actually, the simple example is the real numbers between 0 and 1. The real numbers between 0 and 1 constitute a set that is bounded, but it's not final.
Yes.
That is not finite.
But I think, look at this paragraph here.
So in that the upper bound would be 1 or something like this. This is a great example, rather. But I have a question. I mean, the envelope of T shouldn't be bigger than T, right? Because T is the upper bound. So the envelope of T, the maximum, should be equal to T, not bigger than
equal to M. I mean, envelope
will be equal to M.
Right.
So
the upper bound of 0 to 10 will be 10.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, but this is crucial because I mean, I'll just read from page 139. He says this, and I think it's really crucial. He says the existence of a maximum is a worldly principle of stability. Appearing is never endlessly amendable. Sorry, appearing is never endlessly amendable. There is no infinite ascension towards the light of being there. The maxim of appearance distributes unto the beings indexed to it the calm, equitable certainty of their worldliness. So this is because there is no universe, only world. In each and every world, the immanent existence of a maximal value for the transcendental signals that this world is never the world. I think that this is really crucial because, and he says, a world's power of localization, yes, Because otherwise you could say, for example, that, oh, the maximum degree is not localized. You could have this sort of reflexive plastic operation where the maximal is the thing itself, right? Or is the appearance of everything, or whatever you want to say. Like,
that's a very important quote.
Yeah, you actually get a bound. To get a bound means that the stability of the world is part of the world. You can get a value of appearance for the very stability of the world as such.
But just a question here. Like he says, since the minimum is non-appearance, the reverse of the minimum will be maximum degree of appearance within the world that is equal to the envelope of the transcendental T of the concerned world. But the envelope is the least bigger value, the envelope of anything.
Yeah, the least bigger value of all values. Yeah, the least bigger value. Yeah, it's the biggest value. But it's defined from the bottom up.
Yeah, right.
Right.
Okay.
In this line segment of the real line 0 to 1, 1 is the lowest, biggest value, right?
Biggest value, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, the subtlety there is similar to the conjunction one, because if you have a case where the top two elements have no relation, then the maximum is neither of those two elements, but the common greater element, right? It would be a separate element, similar to the conjunction being neither of the two. But if it is a case of where one is less than the other, then it would be the greater of the two.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But I do think that this is a more subtle point in terms of conceptual phenomenology than it seems, because it says if the scale has an upper bound, if the scale needs to have an upper bound, and this is something we derive from it having a minimum and it having an envelope and so on and so forth, it means that the maximal, the appearance of a totality or of the stability of this world is itself indexed. It is not, let's say, the place of indexing, right? You don't get the sort of,
Can you repeat the last thing?
My point is, let's say, let's put it like this. You could have a theory where maximal appearance is a sort of aconceptual or unlocalized thing, where in a sort of Jorge Luis Borges kind of idea, the map is the territory. It's no longer, let's say, you see my point? Like, it's the totality itself. That's the something.
Yeah, like, this is subtle. Yeah, we would be. I mean, by this definition is given, the minimum is non-appearance. We could be led to think the reverse of the minimum will be appearance itself, like everything, the universe set of the concerned world, but which is not the case. It is the envelope of the transcendental, which is the maximum. So there is a maximum, which is a degree of measure, which does not coincide with the whole that is presented in the situation or in the world.
Yes. So I think this is important because he keeps this idea. He keeps the idea that appearance is, there is a function that is measuring relations and localizing the output of this function in the same world. This is valid for the totality of the world.
It's interesting because I find this argument, which I completely agree with the importance. Could you not make the same argument with the minimum? That the minimum is also localized to the world. There is no absolute minimum, right?
Yeah,
but he doesn't
absolute
make
in
this
the
comment.
sense, the absolute in the sense of unique, but not in the sense that it is. Yeah.
I think this is the same argument that both minimum and maximum is localized to the world because there is no whole.
Yes, both are localized to the world. That's why he says this is a consequence of there being no universe. Yeah, sorry.
Okay, so the reverse of the minimum degree is equal to that degree. Likewise, the reverse of the maximal degree is equal to the maximal degree. In this particular case, cases, double negation is equivalent to affirmation. Formally, with regard to double negation, the minimum and the maximum behave in a classical manner. With regard to negation, just the minimum and the maximum. If the world is non-classical, still the minimum and the maximum with regard to negation behave in a classical manner, right? So actually, the classical world will be a world with just the minimum and the maximum, because you have to have two transcendental degrees. And truth values will be assigned with these degrees. So the minimum will be false, the maximum will be true. There you go. Dependence.
I find dependence very, very fascinating. It's such a fascinating thing. Close down your toolbar on the right, JP.
Yeah, where
the toolbar, the arrow thing. Just
arrow. Where's the arrow?
On the toolbar on the right.
Toolbar. I don't see the toolbar.
Right there.
Okay. Oh, great. Thank you.
And you make fun of his tools.
Okay.
Renzo asked if the maximal is unique. Yeah, the maximal is unique, right?
Yeah, the maximal is unique. Yeah. So let P and Q be two elements of T. That is considered a subset P of T, so defined. All the elements T of T whose conjunction with P, which is just one element, okay, is inferior to Q. This is written B whose elements with the elements whose conjunction with T is inferior to Q. Note that B is never empty, since the conjunction of P and Q is lesser than equal to Q, and that P consequently has at its elements at least P in the conjunction of P and Q, and of course the minimum mu by definition. The conceptual determination of dependence leads us to recognize that it is nothing other. Sorry, it appeared a message here. Internet connection is unstable. Sorry. The conceptual determination of dependence leads us to recognize that it is nothing other than the envelope of P. Let us therefore pose that the dependence of a degree Q with regard to a degree P is the envelope of all the degrees T, such that the conjunction of T and P is lesser than Q. We will write the dependence of Q with regard to P as there's a kind of a notation of implication, traditional implication. Right? Formal definition goes like that. Let's go back to the conceptual definition of dependence. The dependence of an apparent B with regard to another apparent A is the apparent with the greatest intensity that can be conjoined to the second whilst remaining beneath the intensity of the first. Dependence is thus the envelope of those beings there whose conjunction with A remains lesser in value than their conjunction with B. The stronger the dependence of B with regard to A, the greater the envelope.
That's amazing.
This basically reinstates that we are seeing in the formal, what we are seeing in the formal treatment. But this example goes like this. Let's go. Let's consider once again the red ivy on the wall and the house in the setting sun. It's clear, for instance, that the wall of the facade conjoined to the ivy that creeps upon it produces an intensity which remains inferior to that of the house as a whole. Consequently, this wall will enter into the dependence of the house with regard to the ivy. But we can also consider the gilded inclination of the tiles above the ivy. Its chromatic conjunction with the ivy is not nil, remaining included in and therefore inferior to the intensity of appearance of the house as a whole. The dependence of the house with regard to the ivy will envelop these two terms, the wall, the roof, and many others. A classical way to talk about dependence from A with regard to B is expressed in a conditional, no A without B. In body-use algebra, this is expressed by the superior value of A with regard to the envelope of all the B's that are of lesser value than A. Could we say that as we go up in this, what is that? In the stairs of transcendental steps, we approach the maximal value n, and the greater is the dependence that runs downward to each lesser transcendental value with regards to the minimum that seems to be the case, since the value of non-appearance is non-dependent of any other value. Like nothing does not depend on anything else, right?
Yeah, I find this, I mean, the section on dependence, which is this sort of, it gives us this such a broad definition of, or he focuses on this sort of implicative structure that follows directly from the relations of the function of appearance. That's what I find amazing, that suddenly you moved from, like, again, the mereological thing helps, right? Suddenly you move from simply how one thing locates itself in another, or, by the way, to talk about locating itself in another, I hope that after this discussion, if you read Tristan Garcia's Form and Object, you see it's like totally ripping off from this. But if you
the link that you sent?
No, it's a book by this hip French philosopher that says that everything is either inside something or is the container of something else. And now we have like the actual formal tools to talk about what it means to be contained or to contain in this much more general sense, right? Than this like parts and wholes kind of structure. But the funny thing is that we've been constructing this sort of theory of how one thing localizes another, right? A degree gives you the localization of something with regards to something else. And the same kind of topological or kind of topological description of being there turns out to be also the description of a sort of implicative structure, right? If a territory is organized in such a way that such a thing is in conjunction with something, but it's not with something else, this is the envelope of that, and these relations are established, you already have a certain implicative structure in place, right? That he calls dependence, because we haven't really gotten to call it logical implication yet, because there's some fine-tuning to get there, but it's the sort of basic constraints on what will imply what, right? It's a very general sense of implication. But it's kind of amazing to see one thing follow from the other. I agree, Reza.
Yeah, my fascination is as well. I mean, on top of what you said, which is absolutely true, how he basically drives the concept out of the more primitive concepts. Is in classical logic, we take the meaning of implication as in causality, is that if A, then B, as something that if A is there, then B is already is there too. This again, like everything else that he shows, this result of causality, that if A then B, is a special case in his in this algebra, because the implication between A and B in this case returns a degree, is again a degree.
Mm-hmm.
If A then B is a degree, which is the envelope of a territory, which basically returns a degree, and that degree may be less than M.
Mm-hmm.
It is more than mu and less than M, which basically says is in phenomenological world is if an appearance is there, what are the possibilities for another appearance to be there? The possibility is not absolute. And this is exactly how scientific situation works. That if an appearance is there, another appearance may be also there, but what is the possibility of the other appearance to be there, right? This this algebra that explains this is much closer to the actual scientific or phenomenological situations than the classical logic. In a condition where P is strictly less than Q or A is strictly less than B, then yes, if A is there, that means B is there. The dependence is absolute, but otherwise it's just a degree, and that degree could vary between mu and m.
Yes. Yeah, so it's nice to see that, I mean, we arrive at a sort of, he calls it possible causal proximity, right? But it's causal proximity is very nice in the sense of it's a kind of topological idea of causation, right? It's much broader than effective causation, where you only get this sort of.
Now, if like what Dennis said a couple of times, if an A and B are completely disjoint, they are not in a relationship, then A implying B means mu.
Mm-hmm.
Because there is no plausible relationship between the two.
So this is the last page for today. So the next results are if a being B strongly depends on A, which is to say that the transcendental measure of dependence is high. It is because it is possible to conjoin almost the entire world to A, whilst nevertheless remaining beneath the value of appearance of B. In brief, if something quite general holds for A, then it holds a fortiori for B, since B is considerably more enveloping than A. We will now show that if P is lesser than Q, then the dependence of Q with regard to P has the maximal value in T. This is written, equal M. Whatever T may be, we have the conjunction of P and T lesser or equal than P. If now P is lesser or equal to Q, whatever T may be, we have conjunction between P and T is lesser than Q, to the transitivity of lesser or equal than. It follows that the subset B of elements whose conjunction with P is lesser or equal to Q is equal to T as a whole, because every T that belongs to T, to capital T, has the property which defines the elements of B. Its envelope is accordingly the maximum M, which has been defined as the envelope of T. But the envelope of B is by definition the dependence of Q with regard to P. It is thus established that if P is lesser or equal than Q, then P is dependent towards Q. P's dependence towards Q is equal to M. We can immediately derive from this remark a foreseeable property. The dependence of P with regard to itself is maximal. In effect, we always have P is lesser or equal to P reflexivity. Therefore, dependence of P towards P is equal to the maximum.
This is where a good example would have helped Badiou. And I don't know whether so a simple example, I'm not saying it's a good example. Let's remember P and Q are degrees, are not the actual object. So basically it says that if you have something of a lesser degree of appearance is there, something that its appearing is more rare than appearance of something else, for example, then if it is there, then the other thing is already there. So let's make an example. The appearing of moon in the sky with appearing of full moon in the sky, right? The appearing of moon in the sky has a higher degree of appearing. It's more likely you see moon in the sky than you see full moon in the sky. So if the degree of appearing moon in the sky is Q, which is the higher degree, and the degree of appearing full moon in the sky is P. If P is there, then naturally Q is there. So it's certain. So P implies Q, the value is maximum. Now, again, to Dennis's example, in this case, moon and half moon are strongly related to each other. So that's why you can make this. But if you say moon and, I don't know, morning star or evening star, the appearance of these two. So degrees of appearance of these two are P and Q.
But wouldn't you also say that this chapter is not only talking about, let's say, how one appearance, let's say the relations between the structures, relations between the functions of appearance will already have as a consequence certain implications, that if something appears, then something else appears. So this implicative structure, but there's also the fact that implication appears, right? If one thing depends on another, their causal proximity appears.
What does that mean?
Because that's how I understand, like if P implies Q has a maximal value, means that their implication appears.
But what does implication appears mean? Implication is an operator, right? It's an algebraic operator. What does it mean that? What does it mean for it to appear?
It means that it's localized somewhere in this ordering.
The actual operator?
That particular relation of implication.
Like the result of the operator is a degree, and
the result is a degree. Yeah,
there are things mapped to that degree.
I get that. I was confused. I thought that you're saying the operator itself, the result.
No. My point is that this implication appears. I think that's actually like a profound thing. The idea that, because everything we've seen thus far, like the whole gist of this chapter, and I think that everything follows from that basic formula, where the identity function of alpha and beta equals P, because it's relating, it's localizing the relation ID of two multiples, alpha and beta, on a degree P, which is itself a multiple. So everything in this chapter is about localizing appearance. Like things don't appear for us, they appear for themselves, they appear in the world. Never expecting like to need a subject there to be able to say, I see the implication, right? So it's always about, let's say, finding a multiple that is localizing, giving the degree, functioning as the degree of appearance of this relation. So this is valid also for implication. The relation of implication between P and Q appears as a degree M. So it appears as something, right? It's not simply that it exists in this sort of more common sense that I can state it. Yeah, you can state it because it appears. So it's all, I think this forcing this grammar of how is this localized? If it is the case, it must be localized in the world and not simply be for me, right? This is first what justifies this not being a linguistic description, more classically speaking, of formal logic and so on, and being something that is warranted to be in a chapter on the transcendental, in a phenomenology, right? He's trying to embed this in the world. So this implication gets a function of appearance that gives a degree, a specific degree of appearance itself, right? So the implication is also included in the scale of how much it appears. I'm not sure if this is just like repeating what you guys said, but for me, there is some subtlety there. I'm not really kind of stating very clearly.
Yeah, I'm not still caught up with the implication itself appears.
Not implication as an operation, but
yeah.
For example, that's why I think he chooses to talk about dependence and argue an example that is very far away from the sort of causal, the regimes of causality we usually talk about, because dependence in the case of the ivy, the house, the tiles, is a sort of imbrication, right, of appearances that itself appears. That imbrication appears. We see That's
I thought of an example here. In a legal world, the implication, let's say, the fact, let's say the chance or the probability, the possibility that someone who is accused of murder actually did it, that implication actually appears in the form of the evidence.
exactly
presented.
Yeah. Yeah, that's I think it's a good example.
Yeah, but the degree to which that evidence is believable might be greater or lesser.
It can be between maximum and minimum, right?
But isn't simply that's the degree? So
Yes.
the degree, yeah, okay.
But
So,
when
yeah,
look, but when you say like it's probable that Gabriel killed somebody, and so there is this correlation, and in the world of this trial, which is like procedural truth world, right, where the proof stands, like the proof that I had a knife with my fingerprints and the blood of the person, it's actually the measure of that implication, right?
yeah, no, I agree.
So there is actually let's say, to be very crude, there is actually a material basis for the implication. That is, let's say, how it is situated in that world. It is not unsituated.
How is it different than the conjunction? If the degree of conjunction between P and Q is also a degree. So the degree that basically you get from that conjunction is the appearing of that conjunction in terms of that degree. Isn't that similar to this implication?
Yeah, but it's kind of, look, because the dependence of a degree Q with regards to degree P is the envelope of all the degrees T such that T's conjunction with P is smaller than Q. Now, I want to prove that the lawyer wants to prove that I killed someone. A knife that has my fingerprints and their blood, it's kind of like the
envelope.
Yeah, like it's the
yeah. There's even a term. There's a term for when it's maximal. It's the smoking gun.
Literally, yeah. Yeah. So the smoking gun, yeah, we have now a technical term.
There you go. Add this term to the companion. Envelope is the smoking gun.
Yeah, but you see, now we have the means to formalize, let's say, procedural truth, which is much more intuitionistic in the lawmaking world, because proofs can have different degrees of truth that are not just maximal or minimum. It's neither true or false. It's probable as well.
False.
Right? Yeah. And the same machinery that captures this with tweakings and restrictions will give us formal implication.
Yeah, so I think the reason was not that what you said. I was a little bit confused. The reason was that, like I said, yes, the actual dependence appears as something in the world, but the same thing, but also the conjunction appears in the world.
Yeah, exactly. But
also,
I mean,
envelope appears in the world.
But my point is that it's easier to understand, my opinion, conjunction and envelope appearing, than suddenly to talk about an equally appearing theory of implication or dependence. Like that's why it's the last thing he says before he moves to say, you know, I just gave you guys something much better than analytic philosophy, because my theory of logic is actually embedded in a world, because he gave you a theory of logical spaces in the sense of implicative spaces that appears, right? So, I mean, I think you're definitely right. It's not different from conjunction envelope in the sense that this is the general condition of his phenomenology, not to accept relations or operational structures that don't themselves appear indexed to a transcendental. They don't, because otherwise they would be indexed to what? To us, right? Or to this sort of necessary framework of formal logic, which is valid for all worlds. No, he's saying, I don't want to index implication to the laws of thought. I want to index implication to the transcendental, so it must appear. So I think that there is a very, I'll think a better way of arguing for this. I'm making it
I think the
clearer.
last sentence you mentioned, and especially your example of about transcendental, not as the law of thought, but something that is objective, materialist, and objective within the world, is very, very important.
Yeah.
It's very important. Okay.
Great, guys. I can't read another P or Q or I'll die.
Yeah,
I think we are done. I think we finished it. Good
yeah,
job,
I think we should
JP.
give ourselves Caron, amazing summary, man.
Sorry?
I'm sure this was a heck of a lot of work.
That was a lot of work, yes. But yeah, I think it's good. I think it's. I think I may tweak a little bit the document, adding some stuff because some stuff I didn't understand quite well. After we discussed, I think I can make some amends here, and I think maybe we should as well the last documents the Res read that are not available. We should make them available perhaps in order for people to.
I sent book 1. So I'm going to send book 2 after we finish book 2 because, like what you said, I'm going back and make amendments. But I already sent book 1 to you guys.
Yeah.
Great.
Preface and book 1.
Yeah, let's put them up on our new website.
Yeah. Now it's time to publicize the website. We have a website now.
Guys, I need to go. I'm destroyed. It was so nice.
Yeah, me too. But next week, then I think it will be really brief. The business about ordinary logic and.
Yeah, but let's keep. I think we should use it to go over every. I mean, we went through over so much, and we could just dedicate it to this whole debate and get to the object in 2 weeks.
Yeah, and there's some stuff I want to add about ontology and analytical.
Yeah, let's do that. I think it would be a pity to skip over the details of this discussion.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
Great, guys.
Thank you very much.
Bye bye.
Take care.
Yeah.